Okay, over to you. And we're going to just do a quick overview at this point. We will unpack more of it, bits and pieces of it, as we go on.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let me share my screen. Okay, here we go. So at first, I wanted to just have a very, very quick look at the standard Islamic narrative, because it has always been, for most people who took an interest in Islamic origin, a sort of starting point. The standard Islamic narrative is all about a prophet who revealed the Quran to ignorant pagans. Thus, a whole new religion developed, a religion pretending to be the sort of return to a primordial religion, which return corrected the Jewish and Christian deviances of this primordial religion. And then it paved the way for the Arab conquest and the rise of the Caliphal Empire. This is more or less the standard Islamic narrative. But we will see that this standard Islamic narrative and the Islamic reading of the Quran are being seriously challenged nowadays by the new studies. But at first, there is the obvious, which needs to be stated. The standard Islamic narrative has imposed a sort of preconceived idea about Islam, about its origin, and especially that imposed an Islamic reading of the Quran. Without even knowing it, we are kind of forced into an interpretation which abides by the standard Islamic narrative, with concepts such as a unique prophet who uttered God's word, or pretended to utter God's word, which was formed into a book. God's words was a book. The revelation was a book. This book, of course, is the Quran, which is mentioned in the Quranic text. It happened in the Hijaz area in Arabia. It was a pagan environment. The Arabs were pagans, polytheists at this time. It happened at the beginning of the 7th century, around Mecca and Medina. There was an ancient shrine, Abrahamic shrine in Mecca, and also an ancient pilgrimage. Those are the concepts by which we think Islam, and we think Islam's origin. But in order to think Islam, really, we have to start from scratch. This is what the revisionist school of the 70s, John Wansbrough, Patricia Crone, Michael Cook, made clear. We have to start from scratch. We have to start by looking at the sources, at what we know really existed at the time of the origins, and not relying on narrative that were written during the 9th, 10th, 11th century, and even after. So, as we keep on stating the obvious about Islamic narrative, and this is why we have to start from scratch, we see that the standard Islamic narrative does not make sense in many ways. There are many contradictions, many discrepancies, many things that are very odd in terms of logic, simple logic, history, geography. I've put some here. Of course, it's only a selection, but one could ask, why is there no mention at all, or maybe one or two, but quasi no mention of the key role of the Arabs in the major events of the 7th century? You see, Jay, you know that in the 7th century, the Arabs were not only in Arabia, they were kind of everywhere in the Middle East. Here is a map which I have taken from Dan Gibson's Quranic Geography. Those are the main trade routes of the Nabatean Arabs. The Arabs at this time, during the 7th century, they were at the very center of the the struggling between the two main superpowers of the time, the Persian Empire and the Byzantium Empire. We see that the dwellings of the Arabs, they were exactly on the frontier between the empires. The Arabs were implicated, waging war for Byzantium, for Persia, against one another, because they were at the center, at the epicenter of the game of influence, the game of war between the two main superpowers. So it's very strange that in the Standard Islamic Narrative, we have no indication, no mention of the key role of the Arabs during those events. Another thing which is very, very strange, it is that we have now found, thanks to people like Julien Christian Robin and many other archaeologists, we have now found that there is absolutely no trace of any active Arab paganism in the 7th century. Active cults. There might have been relics and old stuff, but there was no active cult at this time, because the Arabs were mostly Christianized at the time. We will see this. Another thing is that the Mecca, the current Mecca, does not fit the Standard Islamic description. This has been pointed out by Patricia Krohn, who pointed the obvious, that Mecca is in the current Mecca is in a desert, and nothing grows in Mecca. But the Standard Islamic Narrative places certain events that we find in the Quran in the Meccan site, and so we are supposed to believe that the Quran describes the Meccans as being farmers who cultivate pomegranates, vines, wheat, olive trees, date palms, and they have camels, goats, and they are also fishermen. They fish and shells in salt water and also in freshwater seas. And there are no freshwater seas in the Middle East apart from Syria and current Israel. So there is something very, very odd here. The Standard Islamic Narrative does not fit the current Meccan site. Also,
Can I just jump in real quickly? And you will get a kickback, and so Muslims have done this with me, and I'm sure you've had it as well, those who are listening. Muslims will say, well, look at Saudi Arabia today. It has olive trees. What are you saying? What do you mean it doesn't have any olive trees? And you look at Mecca today, it has buildings. There's all kinds of enormous, you showed the clock tower, the 4th highest building in the world. So what do you mean that there is no civilization there? There are no big cities there. In the 21st century, yes, because of oil wealth, because of Saudi Arabian oil wealth. It has created all of this in our lifetime, in yours and my, Odon. And this is what most people don't realize. Don't look at modern Saudi Arabia and yes, you have olive trees in modern Saudi Arabia, but in the 7th century, this was just nothing more than a hamlet. There weren't very many people living here at all. This was known as...
This could not have been a big city. It's not possible. Everything has to be brought from the outside. The food for the animals.
Water, there's no vegetation. If there's no vegetation, there are no people. And that's why this viewpoint that because they're there today, they must have been there way back in the 7th century. Absolutely not. There was nothing there.
What has changed? What has changed? It is the wealth of the Arabs. One needs an empire, a very big state to provide for Mecca.
Yeah.
Without the state, and there was no such state, no such empire in the 7th century, no city could have survived in the Meccan desert.
Yeah. And would not survive today without everything being brought in. It all has to be brought in. It's an artificial city.
Exactly. Also, on your channel, Jay, you had Mel, Paul, Joe, talking about Jerusalem and Mecca.
Yeah.
And the thing about the Quran describing Jerusalem and not Mecca. One thing that is very, very strange in the Standard Islamic Narrative is the issue of the place of Abraham, Maqam Ibrahim, the place where Abraham stood. He stood before God as if in judgment, because in a sense, there are two places of Abraham in the Standard Islamic Narrative. There is, of course, the traditional Meccan place of Abraham, but also the Standard Islamic Narrative kind of gives credit to Jerusalem being a legit place of Abraham. Because in Jerusalem, according to the Standard Islamic Narrative, there is the Temple of Jerusalem. We find in the Quran that Zachariah visited Maryam in the sanctuary, Mihrab, which designates the Temple of Jerusalem. We also know that, thanks to the Quran, that Moses led the people to Jerusalem, in fact, to the place of Abraham. And so why did those Islamic prophets, such as Moses, such as Zachariah, and also Jesus, who was teaching in the temple, why were there in Jerusalem if Jerusalem was not the place of Abraham? Why did Moses take the people into Canaan, into Israel, into Jerusalem, and not into Mecca at this time? You see here, there is something that doesn't work in the Standard Islamic Narrative. And this needs to be pointed out. Also, we see in the Standard Islamic Narrative that the Christians are called Nazarenes, Nasara, and they are not called by their real name, Masihun. Masih, is the real name that the Arab Christian used for themselves way before Islam. And we know this because the Christianization of the Arabs has been very well documented. It started at the first centuries, even the first century. We can see in the Act of the Apostles that Arabs were there at the Pentecost. In the Christian tradition tells us about the apostles Matthias and Shimon, who respectively evangelized Jordan and Arabia. We found many Christian inscriptions in Arabia, thanks to archaeologists such as Julien Christian Robin. Here's a photo of an inscription, Christian inscription in Hima, north of Najran, from the 5th century, a Christian inscription. And we have many sources telling us how the Arabs were Christianized, for example, by Saint Euthymius the Great in the 5th century, who baptized an Arab leader, Peter Asbebetos, and this Arab leader became a bishop, the bishop of the Arabs, and he was at the Council of Ephesus in the 5th century. So this is well documented. And even more, we know that at the end of the 6th century, the king, the Persian, made a sort of king of all Arabs. His name was Al-Numan III, Ibn al-Mundir. He was, according to the Chronicle of Seth, the king of all the Arabs of the empires of Persia and Byzantium, and he was baptized. Hence, we understand that every Arab under his rule was baptized too. This was the way, those were the customs of these times. So there is something very strange, nonetheless. The Quran does not talk about Christians as Masih, which is their real name. There is only one occurrence of the Christians being named people of the gospel. Otherwise, they are called Nasara. But Nasara, Nazarene, is not the name of Christians. It used to be the name of the first Judeo-Christians in the first century, but the Christian kind of ditched this name, and they named themselves Mashiun in Aramaic, people of the Messiah, and Masih, which is exactly the same in Arabic, people of Al-Masih, of Jesus. Another very strange thing about those Nazarenes, they are supposed to be Christian according to the Standard Islamic Narrative, but in the Quran, they are described as being the allies of the Jews in the 7th century, which could not have been possible. In the 7th centuries, Christians and Jews were arch enemies. There were some tragic events and uprising of the Jews in the Byzantine Empire, the taking of Jerusalem by an alliance of Persian and Jews, also with the help of some Arabs. And the Jews took over Jerusalem, they assumed power there, and there were many persecutions against the Christian. And beforehand, the Jews were expelled by the Romans in the 2nd century from the land, and they were not allowed to come back to Jerusalem. So there was a strong enmity between Jews and Christians, and they could definitely not be called allies in the 7th century. So something also here is very wrong in the Standard Islamic Narrative. Another contradiction in the Quran, according to the Standard Islamic Narrative, also about the Nazarenes, is that they are described as being the closest to the believers and also as being the enemies of the believers. And this is very strange. And you see that in most translation of the Quran, the translator kind of hides this contradiction. It's a contradiction between the verse in Surah 5, 51 and 82. We will look at them in detail thereafter. And lastly, as the last of the contradiction I want to point out here is it is what you hinted at. There is no trace of Christianity in the Hijaz, but in the Standard Islamic Narrative, Muhammad's wife, Khadija, is supposed to be a Nazarene or a mixed Nazarene, half Arab, we don't really know. But her cousin, Waraka bin Nawfal, is a Nazarene. He's supposed to be a Christian living in a place where there is absolutely no trace of Christianity. And is also being described as a former Jew who converted to Christianism. So it is very strange. The thing also, and we will look at it in detail thereafter, if Khadija's cousin was a Nazarene, and if Khadija was a Nazarene herself, doesn't it mean that all the in-laws of Muhammad were Nazarenes? Mm-hmm. Jewish, former Jewish? You see, we start to unveil, to uncover something.